Right.
I think we could get started. What do you reckon?
Righto. Yeah, let's do that. You ready to go, Chris?
Totally, yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you're watching this from. Welcome to episode 11 of our webinar, On Hold webinar. Today, we've got from New Zealand Aerosports, Chris Brook, who's the head of test jumping over there. Chris hails from the UK, I believe, but has now chosen the land of the long white cloud to be his home in New Zealand. Head test jumper for NZ Aerosports. Chris sent a photo that said that, and in the photo, the caption for the photo was the first working prototype of the layer, or the Petra.
Yeah.
Were there ones that weren't working?
Yeah.
We'll leave that for your conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, Chris, I'll hand it over to you. It's all yours.
Hey, okay. Well, hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. So yeah, I'm Chris. I thought I'd give you a bit of a background. I've been jumping about 14, 15 years now. I've done about 10,000 jumps. A lot of those are on prototypes. I started jumping in the UK, then swiftly moved to Spain to kind of catch the weather, and then traveled around a while, ended up in Australia for a bit, and then found myself over here. And I sort of wandered into Aerosports one day and was handed a beer at about 11 o'clock in the morning and had a long chat with Gyro. And at the time, their test jumper, Malachi, was sort of moving on to do other things. So I sort of fell into his slot. And it wasn't that I didn't really know what I'd, bitten off, but I definitely got involved in some pretty funky stuff that was kind of coming off the back end of the Summer of Love project. So for those of you who don't know, NZ Aerosports started this sort of Summer of Love project back in 2000, and I think it was like 2010, end of 2009. And it sort of coincided with Julian, who is our computation fluid dynamics engineer, turning up to Aerosports. Wandered in one day and asked for a job, and Gyro actually had him making lines and then doing part-time R&D, which was sort of developing the newer canopies. And one day Gyro walked past his desk and sort of saw this computer model of a cell on his laptop and asked him what he was up to. And he had actually made a parabolic model of the cell so he could replicate them more easily. And Gyro was super fascinated. And I think, as Gyro quoted, that was the last line set Julian ever made. And they started this voyage on from right from developing the JVX, and we ended up playing with Crossfire prototypes. And inevitably that ended up in Petra. So there was like 20 something iterations before they got to Petra and all kinds of funky stuff. And I sort of wandered in towards the back end of that when they were still experimenting with getting Petra towards the product stage. So yeah, that's kind of a bit of a history about it. And I can pause here if you want to ask any questions about that. Otherwise, I'll kind of continue.
No questions. I got my eye on chat here, so if anyone doesn't want to verbally ask a question, just whack it in the chat group or the chat bar, and I can ask Chris if you'd like. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, so I'll sort of go through what so from where I take off is when Julian has developed a Canopy in his software. Obviously, it's not a proven thing. Like, the computer will give us quite a few parameters of understanding what the canopy is likely to do in terms of performance. So sort of, for instance, when Petra came along, there was a percentage better than a JVX, and it was like 20-something%, which was extraordinary at the time. And it became self-evident when Nick Batch actually beat the record by 20%. So the science from the computer side of things is pretty accurate, but it doesn't give us a lot of background into things like openings and the feel of the canopy. And that's where the test jumping comes in. So when Julian's ended his end of this project, which is sort of putting the software into a 2D format so that we can actually cut it out on a cutting table. And then once the ladies have sewn it together, or we've measured it all up to make sure it's within the parameters that the computer says it should be, I put it on a set of risers and go to the drop zone. And depending on the type of prototype, if it's something like Petra or Petra 2, usually going to like full altitude for any first test jump, but I'm really getting out the door and deploying almost straight away, because I need to do some stability checks to make sure, one, that I can land the thing, and two, begin to kind of get a bit of an understanding of how it's behaving. I'm not sure how many of you guys out there have watched some of the videos on YouTube. I highly recommend you do the early stuff that Attila and Richie were jumping, and Robbie and Vorney were involved as well. They came over and helped them. Some of those prototypes are out of this world, and it ended up in a few cutaways. So when I kind of got to the stage where we were beginning to process Petra and get through a stage to develop it into a project, I jumped to Petra with a crossed nose. And so this is sort of Julian going, hey, I've developed this. We'll put a closed nose on it, which actually has a mesh nose to help rigidity. And I took it up and jumped it. And I'd never jumped a Petra. I'd certainly never jumped anything with a mesh nose. And I thought I was scared, like scared stiff once it opened. But I mean, I did what I could, and I got it to the ground, and then did a couple more on it. And then it was sort of refining brakes and a few things like that. And then Julian would decide he didn't like the mesh nose, so we'd go and make some other iterations, and sort of the sequence would follow through from there. So once I've got a canopy that I go back to Julian and go, okay, look, it didn't kill me. I landed it safely, and I think we should try this because the flare feels weak, or because we can start, maybe even if it's good enough off the bat straight away, we can actually start working on openings. Openings is a bit of a science in its own right. So I will go back. I'll give the engineer some feedback, and he'll make some changes. And if the canopy is a complete flop, he will probably go back and make some other changes. We don't just give up on an idea because it didn't work. We'll try and understand why it didn't work and then move forward with that. So once I've kind of got to a stage where we're like, okay, this is beginning to feel a little bit more like a product, we'll actually start handing them out to other test jumpers and people we have a lot of faith in and trust in, that they have the experience to jump them, and start gathering feedback. We'll also start scaling different sizes. As you probably are aware, the minute you start scaling something up and down, you're going to get discrepancies between the two and the way they feel, in particular when it comes to openings. So we have to kind of go through a process of starting off at our base size. Base size for like cross-brace canopies used to be like an 86. Now it's a 79 because we're all thin. And we'll work our way up and work our way down from there. And then if we discover some issues, we'll kind of find a limit. Like for instance, when we got to kind of getting down to the smaller sizes of layers, like 60 square foot, we really began to feel like the thing wasn't, like it had no performance once you actually got it leveled out, and the flare didn't feel particularly good, and it was super twitchy. So we sort of had a cutoff size there, and we're like, okay, that's not going to work, and we don't want to keep pursuing that because it's not like there's a market for that or that many people who want a 60 square foot canopy. And on the upper end as well, like you get to a performance trade-off. So I think the largest Petra prototype we ever made was a 119, and it was okay, but it just didn't perform within the kind of parameters that we set, that we kind of wanted it to be targeted at the market for. So yeah, we'll kind of go through that phase of going, right, okay, this is the size, and then we'll start feeding out what we call beta canopies. Now, beta canopies are almost a product, but we need the validation of doing a lot of jumps on them. So until we have like 1,000 jump plus on a prototype, we're still pretty cautious. Like we'll build maybe 10 of varying sizes and select people based on their ability for that size and wing, and hopefully they have some familiarity with that sort of style. So for instance, if they were jumping a Sapphire 2 150, we'd send them a Sapphire 3 150 prototype, and that gives us a real good background for their feedback. So we kind of know what they've been jumping, we know what they like about it, what they don't like about it. And from there, we kind of begin to really refine the design itself. Really, you know, this is the kind of stage we want to be getting as much feedback as possible, so we can kind of make final decisions about what the product's going to end up like. For instance, with the Kraken, which is our wingsuit canopy, initially we were hesitant about using a material like F111. Yes, it's got some low bulk properties, but effectively it wears out real quick. And when you're spending thousands of dollars on a canopy, there's something that didn't quite sit right with us with going, Aunt's done like 500-600 jumps, you got to buy another one. So we made a few ZP ones and we sent them out, but the wingsuit fraternity, being the way they are, and understandably, they didn't want to have 2 rigs for 2 different types of canopies. So we started actually looking into different types of low bulk fabric, and that's an entire process of its own, because we've got to validate the fabric itself, and then we've got to find out how long it's going to last, put through all kinds of UV tests, different places, like we'll send some to Dubai, we'll send some to Brazil where there's rainforests and these kinds of things, and then get them back and do things like porosity tests and tear tests and that kind of stuff, so that we have a good understanding. So the Kraken project was sort of hit a point where we were going, okay, we could just release this as a ZP version, and come what may, that'll be kind of what you get. But we actually went through another 1.5 to 2 years of development trying to get the fabric right, and we tried a few different types before we were happy with the one that we have, which is a lighter weight fabric. It's not as light as F111, but it is a lot lighter than normal ZP, probably about halfway. So you kind of get a bit of a trade-off there. So it's going to last hopefully as long as we found ZP would normally last, but also it packed quite a lot lower. So yeah, that's kind of that would be one side of the fabric development, which is an integral part, again, in high performance. So with Petra, it was a similar story. We did make some ZP Petras, and some what we call hybrids. So we were using the rigidity of polyurethane fabric or sail fabric in the internal structure of the canopy, and then externally would have ZP for longevity. We actually had a few issues with them. Some what we call flutter on the wingtips, and it was inconsistent. And there's nothing worse when you're developing something in inconsistency. So, for instance, we built like 5 79s hybrids. 2 of them might flutter, and the other 3 would be absolutely fine. So after a while and a lot of trying, we actually decided to go with full sail, because it began to become quite apparent that although Petra could be flown by an everyday pilot, and some people do, really its realm was was performance swooping for competition or XRW, and the trade-off with the fabric longevity was worth it for the performance gains. Yeah, that's kind of why we ended up picking those fabrics. So yeah, I'm going to stop again for questions, because I feel like I've been ranting on a bit. No questions? Okay, well, okay, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about what people like to hear when I strike up a conversation about test jumping. It's usually what the most dangerous elements of that are. Well, I suppose we've got to think quite seriously about the canopy collapsing and us getting entangled in it. That's probably the worst case scenario. If we can clear ourselves and cut away the main, that puts us in a good position to get our reserve out, depending on height. And we've had this debate with developing a tertiary rig. Jaro was always a keen fan of just keeping it simple and having a normal rig that you understand exactly where the handles are, and you can get away from the main in a kind of familiar sequence. The only issue, or contentious point that we found after a while, was that if you were to get wrapped up in one, and I've never been wrapped up, thankfully, come close, but never been wrapped up in a main, and you can't clear it and you fire into that main, and that becomes entangled too, then we're kind of stuffed. So we started working with Brett Newman on a tertiary rig that has a belly mounted main. So the main prototype is actually situated on our belly here, and we actually deploy off the door, and the canopy opens up in front of us. It's a bit of a weird thing to get used to, but it gives us a couple of other options. So we have another set of cutaway cables that run up to a large student size ring, and then we've got both sets of risers, one for the prototype, and then the outboard would be for the secondary main. So if you need to cut away from that, you can get away from that, and then the deployment sequence and reserve sequence are exactly the same. It's not something that we've used a great deal up until now. With the way that the projects have slotted into kind of timeframe marketing wise, we actually came off the back end of a canopy called Anna, or towards the end of that, and we're at a stage where we didn't feel the canopy was particularly unstable. So we elected not to use that. However, with developing the Petra 2, with pushing it as far as we want to push it, this is sort of where we've gone back to using a tertiary style design to give us that extra option. So I've kind of had to write a health and safety manual for this kind of stuff, and it put a lot of questions in my head that I would not normally answer. Cutting away low, RSLs, AADs, all these kinds of things. Now those topics in themselves are huge, which is sort of why I'm opening this up again. If anyone has any questions about our preferences or why we would or would not elect to use an RSL or an AAD that's specific to what we're doing, then feel free. So like currently, as the standing is for us in this country, we have an agreement with the NZPIA so that we can, if as long as we're doing just a hop and pop and it's no more than a 3 to 4 second delay, we can actually elect to turn our AADs off for safety reasons under these high performance canopies, because I'm sure as some of you are aware, even this sort of higher end speed digital like Cypress type there, we're really on the cutting edge of what the performance of these canopies is closing in on those speeds. So that's something we have to kind of factor in what we're doing, and we have quite an extensive checklist now of things that we have to go through health and safety wise. I suppose if like come to a point where we're talking a bit about reserves, we elected at one point collectively to actually upsize our reserves. We're all on around about 140s, which meant we had to get that we use Vector and javelins as well. Mainly we went with the Vectors because a lot of us were very familiar with those for the majority of our test jumping, but we have used both. And we ended up switching to like a 140 size reserve for our test jumping, all from like 113s to 126. It wasn't so much that we were having lots of cutaways or anything like that, but we had to mitigate as much risk as we could when it came to deciding on what the best outcome for a bad situation could be. A bigger reserve was probably something that we felt would give us more leeway if we had to cut away from a high performance main. And it was a similar story with sort of skyhooks and RSLs. We went down a road where, again, after a series of cutaways, we found that, or felt that RSLs could be a bit more of a hindrance than they could be a bonus. So we kind of elected to not use those. And as for a team, we all work pretty tightly collectively together. So there's sort of 2-3 of us who are the more experienced end of the spectrum in terms of high performance canopies. But as part of that team as well, we don't necessarily just want to have competition pilots. They're all well and good, but what I began to find, even with like the Sapphire 3 projects, is that we wanted to make the things faster and faster. So getting feedback from test jumpers who are not as experienced, but well within the realms of experience to jump prototype parachutes, we were getting more relatable feedback to the product that we actually wanted. And we operate on a pretty good platform. We're all supplied good equipment, and we all have our own department and funding, so we can we're pretty lucky with what we do on that sense. And I suppose moving forward, people probably want to know a little bit like what we're up to right now. I mean, with COVID, it has been pretty hard to decide what the best way to move forward is. And we're kind of at that stage where we could develop something more to the needs straight away, but actually the decisions have been sort of to continue with Anna, which is our sort of moving on from JFX, JVX canopy towards a layer, but not quite stepping to a layer straight away. And finishing off with the Petra 2 project, which is kind of important to us. It's also a lot of fun. So yeah, I'm going to stop here for any more questions.
No questions. I got a question, Chris.
Yeah, go for it.
So you're talking a lot about the high performance stuff.
Yeah.
What about the big stuff, like the Sapphire 3 290s and stuff like that? Are you test jumping that stuff as well, or Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it was about 4 years ago we decided to move. We decided to move forward and develop the Sapphire 3. And I sort of touched a bit earlier on that we actually had Chris Stewart join us that year or the year before. Regardless, we had a very, very experienced Canopy pilot whose first real job with us after all his competitions, all of the experience, was jumping like 290s. And that is something that we actually had to kind of get used to again. Like we're so focused sometimes on the fast stuff, going fast because that's what we kind of get the biggest thrill from, that going back and jumping things like 290s, 280s, all that kind of stuff was not unfamiliar, but it was certainly something that took a bit of getting used to because they feel so much more unstable in terms of they're quite mushy and they're more susceptible to turbulence and this kind of stuff. And we do jump all of the sizes. We go right through all the way up to the perimeters of like the Sapphire 3 on the sort of student end of things would be right up towards 300 square foot. So yeah, we do. We kind of get a big jump on a broad spectrum of canopies. Yeah.
Cool. There's another question in the chat bar right now. You're test jumping an 80 Petra using a 140 reserve. How do you make sure there's no issues with the container, like mismatched size issues and things like that? I guess.
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. So, and that is sort of touching on a little bit to do with the tertiary. I actually have a 308, Vector 308, and that allows me to have that size reserve with a tray that fits, let's say, up to a maximum of like a 79 Petra, and then that takes it all the way down. Probably I'll put a 64 in there. Now with the sail fabric packing up bigger, it does give us a little bit more room, but we do also have this tertiary that we're developing more specifically for that, so that we can have the main prototype that we're trying to test jump separate from the rig that we have. So, and the beauty of having the setup that we've been developing is that, you know, one day we can hook up a Petra 60 whatever on our chest, and then the next day we could, for instance, with a bigger bag, we could put a Sapphire 150 on there. And so that's kind of that's the way we go around things. Yeah.
Okay. There's another question in the chat bar. You mentioned not using an RSL for test jumping. For the benefit of the lesser experienced people, can you say what the conditions were that you preferred not to use an RSL?
Yeah. So again, that's another really interesting question. I get this question asked quite a lot. So our particular preference boiled down to, it became, when we're under a canopy, I'll give you for instance. So I jumped Petra many years ago and I had line twist straight off the door. I was still pretty high, so I felt I could kind of deal with it. Now, it spun me up so fast, I mean, I was not in a point of blacking out, but I was so utterly disorientated that when I cut away, I mean, God knows how many thousands of feet it took me to sort myself out. And we slow-mode and played the video back and had the discussion about RSL. And that was one particular instance that we really found that there was a good potential for an entanglement with it. And it maybe getting kind of caught on something like, we have a lot of external cameras as well. That's nothing worth mentioning. We have what we call a dick cam, which actually sticks out and protrudes from our stomach. And we sometimes have, cameras. We need angles to capture all kind of parts of it. And so we carry an extra set of risks in terms of snag hazards. And any snag hazard and chucking an RSL in there was a bit of a concern. So when I actually landed from this on my reserve, I'd spun out so fast that I burst the capillaries in the bottom of my feet. So we realized that we were on a point where the canopies are so violent that there was potentially a chance of that kind of thing going on. And we had a discussion as a team and decided that we elected that RSLs were probably not suitable. But I would say, if I'm sports jumping, for instance, and I've got my larger canopy in there, I do have a sky hook. If I'm just jumping with, say, if I'm in a free fly group or something, I do rate them. I do think RSLs have their place, but just not particularly in those particular circumstances for test jumping.
Okay.
What about test jumping tandem canopies? Are you guys all tandem instructors, or how do you do that?
Okay, so that is a really good question, and somewhat relevant to developing a test rig for tandem jumping itself. Now, like I did touch a little bit on the process that we go through when we're developing any canopy, and initially there are a lot of jumps, and I don't know how much money it would take to persuade someone to try and do 50 front rides, but it probably wasn't going to happen. So we actually had a bag designed specifically. So that, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the British skydiving system, but their tandem ratings, in order to do their ratings, they actually do 5 jumps with a weighted bag, and the bag's around about 55, 60 kilos, and it clips on just like a passenger. You know, you've got top clips and side clips and exactly the same. So we use a system like that for the additional weight that we need to test a tandem canopy. Given like we do actually, like myself, Chris Stewart, we do both have tandem ratings, but we actually sort of decided when we started sort of like testing canopies that were coming back, for instance, that have like a problem, or we have a prototype tandem we want to try, we elected to use one person and like someone very experienced who has jumped a different array of canopies, but their last however thousands of jumps have been on all kinds of Icarus tandems, so they have a good idea of exactly what we're doing. And so we actually have a bit of an arrangement with that person, and we like drop the canopies off with them, and they go back and they send us the videos and the feedback and that kind of thing. It's an early like process for us with the bag, because we haven't really done that before, but it was certainly much easier than trying to persuade someone to go on the front all the time. So hopefully when we come to kind of developing the tandem itself, that makes things a little bit more fluid for us.
Thanks. And just one other question about that. Would you change the weight of the bag? Because obviously passengers' weights change considerably, or how do you?
Actually, that's quite interesting. So we've discussed that. We have discussed putting extra weight on. I mean, once we've got a canopy that we're very comfortable with, and we go, okay, this feels like something we're going to go with. This is going to be, you know, potentially a product. We will build a bunch of different sizes. So that gives us a good idea of what it's like to behave at a different wing loading. I mean, I know that's not the entire answer with wing loading. There's a lot of questions around different sizes of wing loading, but once we've got to a stage, yeah, we would probably start using more weight. But it gets to a cutoff point where no one wants to carry like a 70 kg sack of sand around anymore. You know, we have to have something with legs that's willing to do it.
Cool. There's a question about, while we're talking about tandems, are there any new and exciting tandem mains in development?
I don't want to say too much really on this, but we actually for the last few years have tried a few different ideas that we've been playing with now. Unfortunately, with COVID kicking in, and it's a bit of a difficult direction for us to go in, like carry on and pick up that off straight away. But we were doing something with them, yeah, absolutely. I'm prepared to say that much.
All secrets right now. Hey,
Yeah.
I've got a question. All this talk about test jumping, how do you implement the weather conditions? So do you sit down and say, oh, it's real windy today, let's go try this one, or it's raining and hailing, let's go try this one?
Oh yeah, no. Well, I mean, as you can imagine where we are, we get a lot of weather, and we actually have a little bit of a system of cutoff. Like for instance, for the like high-end prototype stuff, really we want ideal conditions. Like it's not much fun landing, let's say for instance, a canopy with a different shape rib or ellipticity in bumpy conditions or conditions that might cause it to collapse low to the ground. So we're quite stringent with that. But with the sort of mainstream, as I want to call it, you know, your Crossfire 3s and your Sapphires and layers and this kind of stuff, we're jumping in up to the limits because we need to know how they're going to behave in those conditions. It's important to all of us to have an understanding of what they're likely to do in strong winds and bumpy conditions, because these are the things that people put them through. So we jump in quite a variety, but yeah, with the more high performance stuff, we try and mitigate as much risk as we can.
Okay. We've got another question in the chat bar. Do you experiment with different D bags, like the semi-stylus axe bag, or do you always keep with the standard deployment bags?
Well, that's a real good question. Like, we all have our personal preferences for our own mains, but with test jumping, from like the very beginning to the end of the process where it becomes a product, we mainly use standard bags. That's been our kind of best results have been with those. In particular, when it came to looking a lot into layer, like tension knots, I'm sure you're aware we had this consistency where people were getting tension knots, and there were a few factors in there that were contributing to those. And D-bags probably was the first focus for us in terms of like, are we having issues with people using like, semi-stylus and X-bags? And these are real common things and people love them, so it's something we had to explore. We couldn't actually find any correlation. We actually found that you were better off with a rubber band, that was double stowed. That was and keeping the line stows neat and a certain size was the best results that we had. But yeah, like we will try some of our canopies with like semi-stylus just out of curiosity, but no, we tend to stick to kind of what the manufacturer would normally send out with it without a special order.
Okay. Jules, you got something?
I do have another question. You were talking about wing loading earlier.
Yeah.
And I know like there used to be this talk of, optimal wing loading, and I still as a canopy coach get asked about that all the time. Just looking at your website with the actual canopies, all your different canopies, and you have like the wing loading chart there, and you've got your minimum or at least maximum wing loading. Like, do you guys from test jumping come up with that graph, and if so, like, how do you figure that out?
Yes, that's another good one, Jules. Love it. So our focus is obviously, like, paramount is safety. So that would be the first consideration with any cutoff at either end. But secondly, it's performance. So how is the canopy performing at that size and wing loading? And then once we've kind of gone through the process of going, okay, this canopy performs best at this size, this, and this, we'll kind of eliminate down to a point where, like, for instance, I was talking about the layer earlier, we got down to 60 and the thing was pretty naff, if I'm honest. It was sinking out the sky, it was super twitchy, and it felt overloaded, which it kind of was for the most part. So we have a cutoff there. Now, for canopies like the Crossfire, which is probably our best seller, we sell, so many of those canopies to a different range of exposed experience and weights. That was more down to a trade-off in performance of when we began to feel the canopy wasn't like performing how we felt the Crossfire should. But that doesn't really necessarily mean that you can't go, for instance, on a lower wing loading of the Crossfire 3. It just won't feel kind of as high performance as we felt like the kind of market was for that particular canopy. So yeah, we have to have, like, at some point where we cut off and go, okay, this is just too lightly loaded and the openings are beginning to get a bit weird, or it just doesn't feel responsive or anything like that. So that's kind of that's how we decide. And a lot of that feedback will come from the beta testing process. So people giving us feedback going, I'm jumping this size compared with this size and it doesn't feel right, etc., etc.
There's another question here for you, Chris. Any thoughts on using small magnets to stow the brakes onto the risers instead of poppers?
It's something I've never really experimented with. It's a bit of a tricky one to answer, because with making changes to anything like modifying risers and brake setups, that's something that actually takes quite a lot of development, and it's not really something that we would necessarily do as a manufacturer of parachutes. It might be something we could do if we worked with a manufacturer of containers. No, I don't. Like, I'll give you an example, and probably going to horrify some people, but for a lot of our risers, we actually use Velcro. Our toggle stows are Velcro. Now, the reason behind that is so that we can actually put the brakes back quite easily and quickly if we need to start doing something else. So I'll actually put my brakes back, and then I can start doing something else, adjust something or try something and leave the brakes where they are. So for instance, if I want to kind of see where they're engaging, all that kind of stuff. I can actually set them roughly where I need them and leave them there. So I know where they are straight away. It's a little bit more fiddly if you've just got to stow them like a normal toggle, but that's not something I've actually played with, so I don't really know much about magnets and risers. My concern may be that you would pick up particles on them or something like that, a little bit similar to people get on the vector stow flaps, maybe. I don't know.
Okay. I've got a question that's probably not test jump related. How do you come up with the names?
Oh, I thought you meant test jumper names. I'm like, we're all called Chris. It's real easy. Jaro described it as actresses and cocktail waitresses. Porn stars is pretty much where we came up with the names. So the Summer of Love was all based off porn stars. So all of those names, there was a lot of extensive research done at the office to make sure we got the name right, matched it with personality. Can't mess that up. So yeah, they're all named after, or except Petra, who's actually named after a model. Jara thought she was hot, so there we go. That's good enough for us.
Okay. Any other questions from anyone?
How about telling us a story about, I don't know, one of the worst or some of the canopies that didn't work? And yeah.
Okay, I'll tell you what, actually tell you my biggest fuck up. And whoever's sitting there who is a wingsuiter is going to love this. So I maybe have 200 wingsuit jumps total. Now I wasn't jumping a particularly big wingsuit. I think it was a Havoc. And I'd maybe done like 50, 60 on this particular canopy. And I got a canopy from Julian. It was a Kraken prototype 129. And he says, oh, I've made this change to the length of the brake, the lines. Can you go and, the thinking at the time was, we'll extend the line set and that'll put the canopy, once it's deployed, out of your burble. So I didn't really think too much about it, if I'm honest. I packed it up, I got my wingsuit, and I think I did like a hop and pop from like 7.5, 8 grand. I can't remember. Sort of towards the end of the day. It was pretty windy, and I opened up and had quite a few line twists. And I wasn't really phased, so sort of slowly I started undoing my arms and legs and all that kind of stuff, and stowing stuff and looking up and thinking about kicking up these twists. And I got to a point where I was beginning to go, okay, like I'm trying to make an effort here, but I can't really get them out. So I'm trying to unwind risers, squeeze them together, everything in my bag of tricks. And it was at this point that I heard my first beep, which is my swoop beep. So I'd got so distracted by these line twists, I was now pretty fucking low. And I thought, well, it's a 129, I can't cut away this is ridiculous. So I kept fighting and fighting until I realized it was do or die. And then I cut away and did what I would normally always do, which is sort of roll backwards and back onto my belly. And I rolled backwards and I went for my reserve handle, which was now covered by a wingsuit wing. Now I managed to get it out, but I probably had a reserve for about 800 foot. So I learned a couple of things at that point. One, it doesn't matter what size the canopy is. And two, deal with the situation at hand straight away. Don't get like complacent and go, oh, it's just a big canopy. Oh, it's okay. It's just line twist. Because what I discovered is that Julian had extended the line set so far that it was next to impossible to kick out line twists. There was just no leverage for me. So yeah, we all learned a lesson. I'm okay. And from there, we began to experiment with shorter lines and actually had better results, because when we started doing CFD on the wingsuits, we realized how far back the burble goes, and we'd actually have to make the line set of a canopy about 90 foot long to get out of the burble, which was just not practical. So there you go. That was one of them.
There's another question here in the chat. Do you look back at stuff that didn't work 5 years ago and maybe then give them a go with some more current knowledge or materials? So the old ideas with new...
Yeah, I think that's actually a really solid point. Yeah, I would say there probably are a few. We call this thing the graveyard, which is like a room we have downstairs with canopies that are rejects, but they're not all like rejects that we've not thrown them. They're not that bad that we've thrown them away. We've gone, we'll put this away, and maybe something down the line will teach us something a bit more about this idea, and we can go back to it and revisit it. Yeah, I mean, we could maybe start thinking about making different canopies out of lightweight fabric, or including lightweight fabric within their design, so you kind of get a bit of a trade-off with bulk and size. It's a really relevant thing. So there probably are a few down there that we'd dig out, and maybe a few years time and go, oh, actually, this is a good idea because we know how to sort this now.
I have another question. What
Yay.
height do you usually do your test jumping from, and does it change depending on the canopy?
Yep. So we do. So we generally go to like 13.5 for the higher performance stuff. We're getting them pitching straight away. A couple of reasons behind that. One, the things are so fast that we realistically don't have a massive amount of time to suss them out. And also, if something does go wrong, although we stand a much higher chance of losing the canopy, the trade-off is if we do get into a situation, we've got a lot more height to deal with that problem. But if, for instance, we're jumping, like a customer canopy comes back and they've said, oh, it's, turn left or right or whatever, we're getting like at 6.5, 7. So we're kind of, there's plenty of altitude, but if we're checking for a left-hand turn, right-hand turn, it's not like we need 13,000 feet, because this time of year it's freezing. So we like to go a bit lower. Yeah.
Okay, we've got a few more questions coming in here, Chris.
Yeah.
Where are you at with the Icarus New Zealand reserve deployment?
Oh, like development.
Development,
yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's something that we're kind of truthfully with sort of sorting out the processes and moving forward from COVID and getting because the factory was shut down. Although the sales team and the majority of the office staff weren't really stopping working, actually were working pretty hard. The factory did stop, so we've had to kind of got to that point now. I'm not sure where everyone's aware of the situation in New Zealand. We moved to level 1 on Monday, so really the factory's only just got back to that point where we're going, okay, this is what we're going to do. And forecasting a trajectory of what we should be on isn't that straightforward or clear for anyone around the world, let alone us. But it is something that we've kind of got in the pipeline. And I suspect, Julian already has a bit of an idea. And when it turns up, I'm sure we'll make plenty of noise about it.
You're talking like pitching straight out the door from 13,500 feet. How long is a petroflight from 13.5 to the ground? Oh,
not long at all, actually. So once we've kind of opened up, got my RSL off, got the brakes off, I can be on the ground in 3-4 minutes, easy. Like if I'm extending it around, or if I'm really fanging it, I'm like a couple of minutes on the ground.
Yeah, so you could beat a 4-way group down.
Yeah, we catch up with tandems that have got up before us pretty easily. Like we have to be pretty careful about stacking right. I mean, anyone that's watched XRW can see that these canopies are falling out the sky pretty quickly. And some of the new Petra 2 prototypes, I'm actually sat on the ground watching Chris Stewart jump them, and like 1 minute I'll look up and he's there, and the next minute he's on the ground. It's astonishing. Yeah.
Wow. As a test jumper, what are the pros and cons of various line types as far as openings, performance, and longevity are concerned?
So when say for instance, got like a brand new prototype that we're not really sure what's going to happen, we'll put a line type on that's probably as close to what we think it will be towards the end of the design, because we're not initially testing for opening. That's not our priority. It's stability and flight characteristics. Does this thing open? Is it safe? And how does it fly? Does it feel like we want it? And once we've got down the line a bit with the refining process, we'll start playing with things like sliders and line type. So for instance, with Petras and all that kind of stuff, we'll build them with the appropriate type of line type Whereas something that's completely off the hook, we're not really sure what category it's going to fit in. We might try a variety. We might put Vectran 750 on it, and then we might try HMA 400 or something like that, you know. Pros and cons. I mean, I think we've been a little bit clear towards the end of the project when we're beta testing. That gives us a good idea of how many jumps people are putting on the lines in different conditions and how long those lines are lasting, because we'll get the beta canopies back and we'll have a good inspection, thoroughly inspect them, and we have a correlation between that and the numbers, and we can actually go, okay, look, HMA just isn't going to last with these kind of canopy. We need to put something with a bit more longevity on it.
Okay. You mentioned the graveyard before.
Yeah.
Is it a big graveyard? Because obviously, as a skydiving public, we only get to see the stuff that's released by NZ Aerosports.
Yeah, I guess that's...
Is there a lot of stuff down in the graveyard? Like, are there a lot of things that don't really make the cut?
Yeah. I'm trying to have a quick guess at what would be in there numbers wise. I want to say between 50 and 80 canopies down there. Yeah, and some of them are just never going to be pulled out there, but we might figure it out down the line. And others are just, canopies made of a particular fabric that we're like, this isn't going to last. Like when we were trying different types of ZP years ago, we were kind of discovering that some of the fabric would peel and the canopy becomes so porous it's not really airworthy anymore. There's quite a few things down there.
So, and I guess it gets to the point where it's like the test jumpers and the engineers and what will say, okay, this one's done. We're gonna ditch it now and start on the next one.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have like a ceremony or anything, but yeah, we'll take it down and we'll lock it up in the room. And then sometimes if down the line we've got another concept in our heads and we go, oh, I remember we tried something like this. Like for instance, on the Crossfire 3 project, we actually pulled a canopy out of the graveyard because we'd done a particular type of cell design on it, and we actually unbolted that cell from that canopy and put it on a prototype to see if it would work in that configuration. So they still get recycled.
And where did the ideas come from? Is it a sit down around a round table and have a brainstorm, or is it someone, 2 o'clock in the morning at the pub go, hey, I've got an idea?
A bit of column A. Like I think Gyro and Pooh would probably be able to tell you they'd sit down and drink a fair bit and draw things on napkins. But those ideas weren't, defunct. Like we do have a lot of spontaneous ideas. Like Gyro was a very he was a genius in his own right, and he had like a lot of spontaneous ideas that would come to him at 3 a.m, and you wake up and there's a text on your phone and we should try this. And sometimes it was valid and sometimes it was like, what? But we generally, we're actually happy to listen to everyone. Unlike most companies, I would say, that are driven purely by the marketing department identifying a need for a particular kind of product, and the R&D department picking it up, we're actually kind of muck in all together and go, okay, like maybe we need to do this now, and we'll talk to Julian, who will then start to think about the design, and then we'll talk to marketing. They'll start to think about how they're going to, encroach that on the public and start making a bit of noise about it, and we'll go off and do our test jumping and kind of collectively work together. The whole factory's involved pretty much.
Okay. Are you using fly sites on most jumps, judging the data, or is it more of a handling and feel of how it flies to you personally?
Yeah, no, it's a real good question. So yeah, like years and years ago, it was pretty much on feel. So I would say that Petra was developed 99% on feel. I mean, we had a lot of collective feedback from probably the best swoopers in the world telling us, what they liked, what they didn't like, and we could see it was easy to match the performance because they were going through competition gates, and that gives you a real good idea of exactly what you're dealing with. We have, in the last 2 to 3 years, started using fly sites quite religiously, and trying to gather as much data as possible. Not so much just so that we can kind of go, hey, look, we've got the best product because it has this particular number behind it, but if we can jump all of the canopies, all of the wing loadings, and we can have that data available, then when someone's like deciding to move down to a different type or size of canopy, they can look at the performance difference factually, so they can actually see at this wing loading what the canopy, how much faster it's going and how much height it's losing. That's kind of where we're going with data collection. It's more of a shareable thing as opposed to we're keeping it for trade secrets.
Okay. This might be a difficult question to answer. How do you become a test jumper?
Oh, fuck. So I think there is a certain amount of luck. Like although I had jumped a lot of different kinds of canopies from different manufacturers before I turned up, that wasn't like a particularly deciding factor in, me pursuing this as a career. It's not, I think the illusion that you have to be insanely brave or insanely stupid, it helps, but it's not like a factor that, is a prerequisite to become a test jumper. Like jumping a variety of canopies would be one thing, but also getting as much coaching as you can and learning as much as you can about canopies, because really that's what it all boils down to. Like, it's understanding what the wings are doing, why they're doing it, and understanding the science behind what's going on when something does go wrong. And that's more important than it is to have like 10,000 jumps on Petras or whatever, It's more of like an understanding of the science and how to give accurate feedback and how to understand what the engineer is talking about versus what you're talking about, and finding a common ground and a bit of a trade-off with what he's able to achieve in terms of what you would like and vice versa. Get coaching. That would be what I would say. Get as much coaching as you can. Off as many good coaches as you can.
Okay. Has anyone got any other questions? Anyone want to sign up to be a test jumper? Jules?
She already is.
So NZ Aerosports just do canopies right now. Is there any talk of anything else, i.e. containers?
Nah. No. We're purely focused on canopies. That's where our passion is. That's where, that keeps us busy enough, adding more irons in the fire would probably complicate things a bit more. No. We'll leave the containers to container manufacturers.
The paragliders?
No, but I'll admit we've made a few sort of speed wings a few years ago. It's the speed wings. They were more kind of like open nose Petras, and people tried them out, and it was an idea that kind of worked, but not something that we've kind of continued with. The idea at some point was to try to make like a ground launch canopy, which is what the GLX was, and we actually made a couple of crossfire type things as well, but they weren't really that great. And the sort of pursuing making a pure paraglider or pure speed wing was such a huge amount of like development work and financial outlay, it would be a bit of a gamble, I think. And there are so many good speed wing canopies out there already. Oh.
All right.
Yeah.
Does anyone else have any questions? Thank you, Chris. That was
no worries.
There is a comment here. Any thoughts on a single surface parachute?
I think Ian has actually emailed us about this a few times. It's something that actually Julian has talked about a little bit and had to think about. I think at the moment there's just a lot going on, and going down a road like that right now might be tricky, but I wouldn't rule it out. Yeah, sometimes we definitely have been known to try some strange stuff.
There's a question, do you have enough test jumpers?
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do. But yeah. Okay. It's funny how quick people have to put their hands up for that. The boys are out test jumping today and it's freezing on the ground, so God knows what it is up there. I'm happy to be talking to you guys.
Oh, you've got a broken back too, don't you?
I've got a broken collarbone.
Collarbone, yeah.
That's not really helping much. So.
Yeah, that's the way. What's a typical day of a test jumper look like?
So it's pretty varied, but I guess the guys, since I gave the guys this morning, would have got everything pretty much ready last night, all the gear, the canopies that they're going to jump. We have a bit of a weather call process, and then they'll go out once they've called the drop zone first thing in the morning, just to double check. I'll drive the canopies out there. Then they'll start manifesting to get on loads. I'll do 2 or 3 jumps and then make some adjustments to the canopies maybe, or get down and have a look at the video and have a bit of a chat and see if they want to change anything or if they want to go and try something different on it. And after sort of like a standard day, they'll come back and all of the fly site data and video footage will get loaded to like a cloud that we have at work, and then all their feedback is then uploaded onto an internal, I guess it's like software development program that then Julian, who actually lives in France, that then when he wakes up, he can actually go, okay, they jumped these canopies today, these are the videos, this is the fly site data, and this is what they said. So then by that next day, they'll have feedback from him as what he would like to try or what he'd like to see.
Okay. What happened to the Spanish Icarus?
They renamed themselves Icarus World maybe 4 years ago. They're a separate company to us now, and they were building our canopies under license. And it just didn't work out, and I think we went our separate ways, and they're kind of doing their thing, and we're doing our thing.
Wasn't there something in Tennessee too? Weren't they being made over there?
I'm not sure if
No?
they've been made in Tennessee.
No,
Okay.
okay.
I mean, years and years and years ago, I think potentially Precision was helping with some manufacturing of crossfires, but don't quote.
Okay. Explain how PGs, I'm assuming that's paragliders, now have single surface gliders rather than a roundy.
Hey?
Ian, if you're there, do you want to clarify what you mean by that? We unmute you.
Mute.
There you go.
Yeah, so there was a question by Mark Silliphant, isn't that a roundy? And so most people think of a single surface parachute as something that floats down like a round parachute. But paragliders now have progressed to where they can actually create the entire like elliptical shape with a rolled leading edge, and it's like a cell design with no lower surface, and it glides and flies exactly like a parachute. So we use it like for hike and fly, so it's lightweight to carry up the hills. There's also a version where just the front nose has a enclosed cell and the trailing edge is all single surface. So that means you can have a really tiny piece of fabric, just like a bit over 1 kilogram or 2, that you can glide down the hill from. And so it would, if it was developed, you could have it perhaps as a tiny reserve and of course as a main. And yeah, they fly just like a normal paraglider.
There you go. Any comments on that one, Chris?
Yeah, there's the technology in paragliding is kind of quite, I would say, quite a little bit further ahead than parachute design. My only concern with that would be getting the thing to open, because a lot of the way that these, I mean, the slider pays some effect in the opening, but also the closed nose has quite a lot to do with the way that the canopy is opening as well. Because a lot of the crosssports, we call it proportionately tuned crosssports, but effectively all it means is we've scaled the crosssports as larger down to smaller so that we can control the pressurization of the canopy more in sequence. So I think once the thing was opening, it was brilliant, but getting it to open might be a bit of a thing, a problem. I don't really know, but I like the logic behind it. And if you actually look at a parachute, when we've done CFD of them, the laminar flow over the top isn't really married and matched particularly cleanly underneath. There's actually quite a lot of disturbed air underneath, and maybe that's why those guys have moved forward with that, because there's no laminar flow underneath. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
No worries.
Any other questions out there? We're coming up to an hour now. Does anyone have anything else? Doesn't look like it. Chris,
No.
appreciate it. That's
You guys are welcome.
That's awesome, man. Well done.
Anytime.
Yeah. Good luck with your injury recoveries and moving house.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
No problem. Feel free to hang around. We've got another chat coming up
Cheers, Jules.
shortly. Again, Chris from NZ Aerosports, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Thanks for the chat. Thanks for the info.
No worries, Henry. Cheers. Thanks, Mark. Take care of yourself, guys.
Thanks, Chris.
Stay safe.
You too, buddy.